Okay, so now we are getting the blood for our recipient cross match. So we've got our purple top tube, we've got our supplies to get blood. So all right, I know. You're a very good girl, Gab. All right. Okay, friend. Hi, Gabby. Alcohol. Good job, Gab. Good job. You are doing fine. Gabby, you're okay. You're okay, Gab. You're okay, Gabba. Gabba, gabba, gabba. Gabba, 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 gabba. Gabba, gabba. We can see this on film, yes. Gabba, gabba, gabba. Gabby, 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 gabby. Gabby, 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 gabby. Good girl. Good girl. Good job. You are doing a good job. Okay. You're doing a good job. Hi. What's going on? What's going on? All right. Get just a little more. A little more. Okay. Right. Good. All right. So now you're okay, Gabby. All right.
Okay.
So we will put it into our vacutainer.
You're doing just fine. There's alcohol in your arms, so
She's a very good patient. You did a good job. Okay, slowly but surely getting there. You're okay, Gab. What are you doing, bud?
I'm doing
All
good.
right, so now that we have our blood, we want to invert it. And we will label our tube, and we'll make sure that we label it with her name and that she is our recipient. So I'll put a big R on there for recipient. Okay, so for this procedure, we're doing a cross match. We're getting blood from our donor. So we've got our alcohol swab, our purple top tube, and we're going to use a butterfly because he's just a little guy.
You see me doing this?
All right, my friend.
All right, my little love bug.
All right, sweetheart.
We can do this.
Okay. Oh, you're very brave. Okay. We put our needle in, bevel up. Okay, bud. Good boy. Good job, handsome. Good job, sweetheart. Getting there, slow and steady. Good job. Very good boy.
This is awesome.
He is awesome. So I'll do a little bit more. Okay. So now we will put it into our purple top. Let it flow in on its own. You're such a good guy. You are a good boy. You're a good boy. make sure we invert the tube several times to make sure it's mixed. And then we will write his name and a D for donor, so that we know when it's ready, we can differentiate between the two. So we've got Rocky and then D for donor, and now we're ready to spin them down. Okay, so now that we've collected our donor, Rocky, and our recipient, Gabby, we are going to centrifuge them. Make sure they balance each other out. The centrifuge. And we want to centrifuge for 1,000 times 9, which it's hard to do because we can't really adjust the speed like that on the centrifuge, but we want to do it for 5 minutes, and then we will be able to go on to our next step. So set our timer for 5 minutes, and then we'll go to our next step, which is washing our red, or separating into our different tubes, and then washing our red blood cells. Okay, so we have our tubes ready, and we have our plasma and our red blood cells. Gabby's plasma is a bit lipemic, so we will collect our plasma first before we get to our red blood cells. So we have our recipient plasma tube. Get our fresh pipette, and then take our recipient sample, and very carefully, without mixing or disturbing our cells, we want to go in and get our plasma and then put it into our tube. I want to discard that, and then we'll hold on to this for just a second. So now our plasma is ready for when we get to that step. So put that there. And then next, we want to get our donor plasma. So we'll have that ready. And we have our donor sample. Get our fresh pipette. And again, we very carefully want to get that plasma without disturbing our red blood cells. We're putting it into a clear, non-additive tube until we are ready for it. All right, discard that, and then we'll hold on to this for just a second for our next step. So now we have our donor plasma and our recipient plasma. We'll put those off to the side for just a second. Now, and we'll get to these in a second as well. Now what we're going to do is our red blood cell wash. We want to wash each 3 times. We want to make sure that the supernatant is clear. So what we will do first is put our red blood cells in. So our recipient, and when we wash our red blood cells, we want to make sure that we're getting 1 drop of red blood cell to about 20 drops of saline, or we want to fill the tube at least 3/4 of the way full. So, and that way you can be pretty sure that for each drop of red blood cell there's enough saline. So discard that. Okay, so we have our recipient
red blood cells we're ready for. So now it's time for our donor red blood cells. And again, we want to put them into our non-additive clear tube, transparent tube. Okay, discard that. Okay, so now we have our donor red blood cells, our recipient red blood cells. Put our caps here. So now we will start our wash. So we have our saline solution, and we just want to do it about 3/4 of the way so that we know each red blood cell, or each drop of red blood cells, is getting the appropriate amount of saline. And then we want to just invert it to mix, and we will put that into our centrifuge. We want to do the same thing with our donor red blood cells. So 3/4 of the way. Okay, so now we want to centrifuge for about a minute. So put it all the way up to get it started. Move it to the 1 minute mark, and then we'll begin our next wash, because we do this 3 times. Okay, so our first spin is done. So we've got our recipient and our donor. So now we're going to use just an extra little cup so that we can discard our dirty saline. So start with our donor, and we want to make sure that we are very carefully getting the supernatant without disturbing the red blood cells. So easy to do for the top portion, not so easier once we get closer in. The supernatant is pretty clear. We definitely, if we did it 3 times and it still wasn't clear, we would want to do it again. But just because it's clear doesn't mean that we want to not continue with the rest of our washes. Okay, getting a bit closer now. Okay, so again, we just want to get the rest of that saline. Do one more. There we go. We'll discard that. And then we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to add our fresh saline. We want to put it to about 3/4 of the way full. Put our top back on there, and then we'll put it in our centrifuge. And we'll also do our recipient one, so that way they can balance each other out. So, get a fresh pipette. And we want to take off our dirty saline without disturbing our packed red blood cells there at the bottom. Okay, get a bit closer. I want to very careful. Okay, discard that. And again, add our fresh saline for our second wash. Okay, and then we will spin it down again. Get going. Get our time right. And then we'll be ready for our final wash. Okay, so our centrifuge is done. So we'll begin our third wash. Coming out pretty clear. So we'll start with our donor. We'll remove our saline. As we get closer to the bottom, again, want to be very careful not to disturb our packed red blood cells. A little bit. There we go. And for our last time, we want to add our saline. Make sure it's about 3/4 of the way. And then we want to invert it so that it's washed. Put it back into our centrifuge. And then with our recipient, do the same thing. Okay. Put our dirty saline into our cup. Okay, and again, you want to be very careful not to disturb our packed red blood cells. And we will add our saline for our final wash. Make sure that they're all set. Okay. Put it down to our timer, and then we'll be ready to move on to our next step once we finish washing our red blood cells. Okay, so our final spin is done. So we're ready to take off our dirty saline and then create our resuspension. So do our donor red blood cell. Remove our dirty saline. Okay, as we get closer to the bottom, you want to be very careful. Okay, so now we have our washed red blood cells for our donor. We're just going to hold on to that for one moment, and then we'll get our recipient, the dirty saline. Okay. And then again, as we get closer, we want to be really careful that we're not disturbing our packed red blood cells. Okay, so now we have our recipient red blood cells and our donor red blood cells, and we want to resuspend them to make a 3 to 5% red blood cell solution. The way we do that is we take 1 drop of red blood cells to 20 drops of saline. So this is our, this will be our resuspended red blood cell solution for our recipient. We've got our recipient red blood cell right here. So we will open this. And we will take 1 drop of our washed red blood cells and add it to our tube. Okay, now for the fresh syringe, since this bottle makes it difficult to do accurate drops, we're going to use a pipette so that we're sure we get our 20 drops. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. And now gently with our pipette, I'm going to resuspend these to make our red blood cell solution. And then we will put that aside for just a moment. Put that over here. So now we have our donor red blood cells, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take our resuspended red blood cell donor tube, and we'll put that right there. So a fresh pipette, and we're going to do 1 drop of our freshly washed red blood cells. So just 1. Discard our pipette. Put our red blood cells to the side. Again, with a new pipette. We're going to do our 20 drops of saline. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Goes. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Okay. And now we will gently mix our suspension. And we will put this over here. So now we have our resuspended red blood cell suspension for each of our cross-match recipients. So now we will clean up our area before we get to the next part, because we want to make sure we have a lot of tubes here. We want to make sure that we're using our correct tubes. So let's do our donor on one side, our recipient on the other. So this is our recipient plasma, so we need that. And this is our donor plasma. And then we have our major cross-match, our minor cross-match, and our control. Okay, so we'll do our control panel first. Open that. And then we want to have 2 fresh pipettes ready. So we want to do 2 parts plasma to 1 part red blood cell solution. So we have our control, which is our recipient and our recipient. So we'll do 1, 2. To 1 part red blood cells. 1 drop. Put these back here because we're going to need them. So now we have our control. So we just want to mix it very gently. And then we're going to let that sit at room temperature for about 15 minutes, and we're going to move on to our next one. So the next one we'll do is our major BCM. So this is our recipient plasma and our donor red blood cells. So we'll open that up. Our things. So again, recipient plasma. We'll do 2 parts of our plasma. I do 1, 2. Put that aside, and then we want to do our donor resuspended red blood cells, and then it's 1 part of our red blood cell suspension. Okay. Back there. And now we'll again gently mix. And we're going to let that sit for 15 minutes at room temperature. Last is our minor BCM. And so for our minor, it's our donor plasma and our recipient cells. So we will take our recipient red blood cells. It's just 1 part there. And we will do that with our donor plasma. This will be 2 parts. 2 drops of plasma for 1 drop of red blood cells. 1, 2. Okay. And again, mix it just very gently. And now we will incubate at room temperature, and then we'll be ready to centrifuge and then to examine it. So we'll let it incubate for 15 minutes. Okay, so now that we've had our samples sitting for 15 minutes, we're going to centrifuge them for 15 seconds, and then we're going to examine them for macroscopic agglutination. So we've got our control, our major, our minor, and then to balance it out, we'll add another tube. All right, once it starts spinning, here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So 15 seconds. Wait for it to slow all the way down. Okay, so first one is our major, and you can definitely see some agglutination there. You can see those kind of the red blood cells clumping together. So we'll put that there. And then we will write in our record, which doesn't fit on camera. Let's grab that. Okay, so we'll keep track of our observations here so that we can transfer it to our record. So we'll write major. We saw macroscopic agglutination. For our next one, we'll look at our minor. And again, you can see, it will focus, some agglutination macroscopically. Again, it's those red blood cells really clumping together at the bottom. So we'll put that there. And then again, we'll do our minor BCM. We saw macroscopic agglutination. And then finally, we have our control, which, as we would expect, doesn't really have any agglutination because it's from the same patient. So from here, we will add a drop of these to our slides and we will examine them microscopically over at the microscope. Okay, so now that we have our slides, we can start looking. So we'll start with our major. So we're looking for microscopic signs of agglutination, which would mean that our two patients would not be a match. So start at 10, get ourselves into view and focused. And when we're looking at our slides, we want to do kind of a zigzag pattern, so we're making sure that we're looking at all fields and not missing anything. So now we will move up. And already at 10, you can see that there's quite a bit of agglutination. So it looks like, unfortunately, these patients would not be a match. But we'll move up to our high dry, get a better look. There we go. And yeah, seeing a lot of agglutination. So unfortunately, looks like these dogs would not be a match. Okay, so now we've loaded our minor BCM. We did see some signs of agglutination macroscopically, but we'll take a look at it microscopically as well. And at this point, it's looking like our two subjects won't be a match, but it's important to look at all of our samples anyway. So I just want to get this focused. There we go. And then again, we scan in our zigzag pattern so we're not missing anything. And yeah, unfortunately, you can already see agglutination, a pretty good amount of it too, much more than we saw on our control group, mainly because we didn't really see any on our control group. And so that agglutination would say to us that these two dogs are not a match. We want to make sure we continue looking at the sample. So yeah, agglutination on the minor BCM, so unfortunately, looks like they wouldn't be a match. So we also want to make sure that we are checking our control, just to make sure that we have something to compare it against. So we have put our control slide on, and yeah, in comparison to our major BCM, there is no agglutination on this sample. So unfortunately, you know, as we said before, it looks like our patients would not be a match. Okay, so now that we've done our observations and we've taken our notes, we want to write it down in the record. So we want to write major BCM had both macroscopic agglutination and microscopic agglutination. And we want to do our minor BCM was the same thing, macroscopic agglutination and microscopic agglutination. So now that we've recorded this, that they are not a match, we would be all set.